Britain needed a proper night fighter, something fast enough to catch a Heinkel, heavily armed enough to destroy it quickly, large enough to carry the new airborne radar equipment that weighed over 400 pounds. The solution came not from a careful design study or a considered requirement, but from a Bristol aircraft engineer named Leslie Fries, who in late 1938 essentially decided to bolt together parts from two existing aircraft and see what happened. The result was an aircraft that would serve on every front of the Second World War, sink more Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft, and evolve into one of the most feared maritime strike aircraft ever built. The result was an aircraft that would serve on every front of the Second World War, sink more Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft, and evolve into one of the most feared maritime strike aircraft ever built. But as a heavy day fighter, its original intended role, it was, by almost any measure, a failure. That aircraft was the Bristol Beaufighter. To understand how the Bolshevik came to exist, we need to briefly return to 1936 and a rather different aircraft, the Bristol Blenheim. The Blenheim was, in its day, something of a sensation. When it first flew in 1936, it was faster than most contemporary fighters. The Air Ministry loved it. Unfortunately for everyone involved, by the time war actually started in 1939, the Blenheim was already obsolescent. It was too slow to escape modern fighters, too lightly armed to defend itself effectively, and suffered appalling losses in daylight operations. But, and this is where our story begins, the Blenheim's fuselage structure and basic design were sound. The wings were rugged. The engine's two Bristol Mercury radials were reliable if underpowered. Leslie Fries, Bristol's chief designer, looked at the Blenheim in late 1938 and had what can only be described as a pragmatic revelation. What if we took the Blenheim's wings and tail, fitted them to a new, shorter fuselage, installed much more powerful engines, and created a heavily armed, multi-role aircraft that could be in production quickly? The Air Ministry was initially skeptical. This wasn't how aircraft design was supposed to work. You didn't just cobble together bits from existing aircraft. You started with a requirement, produced drawings, built prototypes, conducted trials. Friss's response was essentially, watch me. By April 1939, Bristol had produced initial design drawings for what they called the Type 156. The concept was straightforward, almost brutal in its simplicity. Take Blenheim wings, strengthen them, attach them to a new fuselage approximately 41 feet long, power it with two 400 horsepower Bristol Hercules radial engines, considerably more powerful than anything on the Blenheim, and arm it with 420mm Hispano cannons in the nose, plus six 303 Browning machine guns in the wings, 420mm cannons. To put that in perspective, most contemporary British fighters carried 8.303 machine guns, which was already considered heavy armament. The Hurricane and Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain relied on those rifle-caliber machine guns. The Beaufighter would carry 4 cannons each capable of firing 120 rounds per minute of high-explosive ammunition. It was an absurd amount of firepower for 1939. The Air Ministry, facing the increasingly obvious reality that war was imminent, and that Britain desperately needed more combat aircraft of any description, placed an order for 300 Type 156S in July 1939, before the prototype had even flown. This was, to put it mildly, unusual, but these were unusual times. The prototype Beaufighter, serial number R2052, made its first flight on July 17, 1939, from Filton, near Bristol, piloted by Cyril Ewins, Bristol's chief test pilot. The aircraft was interesting. It was large, considerably larger than contemporary fighters. Wingspan of 57 feet, 8 inches, maximum takeoff weight, eventually reaching over 25,000 pounds when fully loaded. It looked, frankly, like someone had taken a light bomber and removed all the unnecessary bits. Eshens reported that it flew well enough, though the controls were heavy. This was not a nimble aircraft, and it had some rather concerning directional stability issues, particularly in the event of an engine failure. Lose one engine on takeoff, and the Beaufighter had a tendency to swap ends rather violently. But it was fast. Initial tests showed a top speed of approximately 335 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Not Spitfire fast, but considerably faster than any bomber it might need to intercept, and faster than most contemporary fighters when carrying a full load of fuel and ammunition. More importantly, it was roomy. The fuselage had space for a navigator radar operator seated behind the pilot, with enough room for the bulky air interception AI radar equipment that was being developed in parallel. Development continued through late 1939 and early 1940, with Bristol working frantically to get the aircraft into production. Several issues emerged. The Hercules engines, while powerful, were initially unreliable. The four cannons generated so much recoil that the first prototypes suffered structural cracking around the nose. The tailplane required strengthening after vibration issues appeared. But by September 1940, as the Luftwaffe switched from daylight attacks to night bombing, what became known as the Blitz, the first operational Beaufighters began reaching RAF Fighter Command squadrons. Production of the Beaufighter MKIF, F for fighter, began in earnest. The aircraft entering service weighed approximately 21,000 pounds fully loaded, was powered by two Hercules third engines producing 1,400 horsepower each, had a top speed of about 330 miles per hour, a range of roughly 1,500 miles, and carried, in addition to those 420mm cannons, 6.303 machine guns. On paper it looked formidable. In practice it was about to become something rather different than anyone originally intended. The first RAF squadron to receive Beaufighters was No. 25 Squadron stationed at North Weald, which took delivery of their first aircraft in September 1940. The timing was fortuitous, if you can call being bombed nightly fortuitous. A blitz was in full swing, with hundreds of German bombers attacking British cities every night. The Beaufighters' role was clear: find the bombers using airborne radar close to within cannon range and destroy them. The reality proved considerably more complicated. The early AI Mech 4 radar had a maximum range of about 3 miles under ideal conditions, which sounds useful until you realize that finding a single bomber in hundreds of cubic miles of dark sky, even with radar, was extraordinarily difficult. The radar couldn't distinguish altitude, so operators often guided pilots toward contacts that turned out to be above or below them. The system was prone to interference, particularly near the coast. And the Beaufighter, while fast for a large aircraft, wasn't particularly maneuverable. If you overshot your target, getting back into position took time and patience. The first Beaufighter night fighter victory came on the night of November 19, 1940, when a crew from 604 Squadron pilot Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham and radar operator Sergeant John Phillipson intercepted and destroyed a Junkers Ju-88 bomber over southern England. Cunningham would become one of the RAF's leading night fighter aces, credited with 20 victories, 19 of them in Beaufighters. His success illustrated what the aircraft could do in capable hands. The radar operator would guide the pilot to within visual range. The pilot would identify the target, absolutely critical, as shooting down a friendly bomber was an ever-present risk, and then close to about 200 yards and open fire. Our 420mm cannons at 200 yards did catastrophic damage to aircraft built largely from aluminium and fabric. Heinkel 111S and Junkers 88S quite literally disintegrated under that volume of fire. Surviving German aircrew reported that being attacked by a Beaufighter was terrifying. One moment everything was normal, the next your aircraft was coming apart around you, often without any warning whatsoever. By early 1941, Beaufighter-equipped squadrons were achieving regular successes. The aircraft's long range, roughly 1,500 miles, meant it could patrol for extended periods. The radar, gradually improving with the introduction of AI Mech 8 sets, gave crews a genuine capability to find targets in complete darkness, but the Beaufighter also revealed significant limitations. It was difficult to fly, particularly for inexperienced pilots. The heavy controls required constant muscle, and the aircraft's tendency toward engine failure-induced spins killed several crews during training. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a forgiving aircraft. Moreover, as a day fighter, which remember was part of its original design requirement, it was frankly inadequate. The RAF tried using Beaufighters as long-range escort fighters for bomber formations in 1941. The results were disappointing. Luftwaffe Bf 109S and FW 190S could outmaneuver the Beaufighter with ease. Its heavy controls made dogfighting nearly impossible. Several Beaufighters were lost to German fighters, with the crews unable to evade or effectively fight back. The Beaufighter, it became clear, was not a heavy fighter in the traditional sense. It was too large, too heavy, too unmaneuverable. But it was about to find its true calling in a very different environment. In April 1941, RAF Coastal Command began receiving Beaufighters, initially designated Merc C, C for coastal. These differed from the fighter variants primarily in equipment. They carried additional navigation gear and provisions for carrying bombs or torpedoes under the wings. Coastal Command's mission was maritime patrol and anti-shipping strikes. German U-boats were savaging Atlantic convoys, and Axis supply ships were keeping Rommel's Africa Corps supplied in North Africa. The Royal Navy couldn't be everywhere. Coastal Command needed aircraft that could patrol long distances, attack surface vessels effectively, and defend themselves if intercepted by enemy fighters. The Beaufighter, it turned out, was remarkably well suited to this role. Its long range meant it could reach far into the Bay of Biscay, the North Sea, and the Mediterranean. Its heavy armament, those 420mm cannons, could shred the superstructure of merchant vessels, small warships and U-boats caught on the surface. And its relative speed meant it could usually escape if German fighters appeared. The tactics evolved rapidly. Initially, Beaufighters attacked ships with cannon fire alone, targeting the bridge and deck-mounted weapons. By late 1941, they were carrying 250-pound bombs under the wings, attacking from low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet, to skip bombs into the sides of vessels. And then in 1942, Coastal Command introduced rocket projectiles. The RP-3 rocket, essentially a 60-pound armor-piercing warhead attached to a solid-fuel rocket motor, was devastatingly effective against shipping. B-fighters could carry 8 of these under the wings. At ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards, pilots would fire salvos of rockets at merchant ships, E-boats, minesweepers, and even larger warships. The effect was dramatic. A direct hit from an RP-3 could punch through the hull of a merchant vessel below the waterline. Multiple hits could sink a ship outright or cripple it for follow-up attacks. By 1943, Beaufighters, operating from British bases, were making daily armed sweeps over the North Sea and Norwegian coast, attacking German coastal convoys. The Germans called these attacks Küstenfliegerpest, the coastal air plague. Losses among German merchant shipping climbed dramatically. But it wasn't one-sided. German ships were increasingly heavily armed with 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns. Beaufighters attacking at low level flew through storms of flak. The aircraft was tough. Its radial engines could absorb considerable damage and keep running, but losses mounted. Between 1942 and 1943, Coastal Command lost over 200 Beaufighters to enemy action and accidents. Crews developed tactics to minimize losses. Attacks were coordinated, with multiple Beaufighters attacking simultaneously from different directions to overwhelm defensive fire. Fighter escorts, Mosquitoes or Mustangs, were provided when possible. Attacks were timed for dawn or dusk, when visibility favored the attackers. One particularly notable operation occurred on April 19, 1943, when 16 Beaufighters from 143 Squadron and 236 Squadron attacked a German convoy off the Dutch coast. The convoy consisted of 4 merchant ships, escorted by armed trawlers and E-boats. The Beaufighters attacked with rockets and cannon fire, sinking 2 merchants and damaging the others for the loss of 2 aircraft. It was this kind of operation, low-level, heavily armed, coordinated strikes against shipping, that became the Beaufighter's signature role. The Beaufighter saw extensive service in the Mediterranean from 1941 onwards. Operating from Malta, North Africa, and later Italy, Beaufighters attacked Axis convoys supplying German and Italian forces in North Africa. The Mediterranean presented unique challenges: longer overwater distances, hotter temperatures that reduced engine performance, German and Italian fighters that were often more maneuverable than anything the Beaufighter faced over northern Europe. Despite this, Beaufighter squadrons inflicted severe losses on Axis shipping. By 1943, it was estimated that Axis forces in North Africa were receiving less than 30% of the supplies they needed, in large part due to aerial attacks by Beaufighters and other strike aircraft. One particular success came in June 1942, when Beaufighters from 272 Squadron operating from Malta intercepted an Italian convoy attempting to reach Libya. The Beaufighters, attacking with torpedoes and cannon fire, sank 1 merchant ship and severely damaged 2 others. The convoy turned back, never reaching its destination. In the Far East, the Beaufighter arrived in late 1942, initially operating from bases in India and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. The primary threat was Japanese maritime supply lines and increasingly Japanese bombers attacking Allied positions. The Beaufighter proved remarkably effective against Japanese targets. Japanese merchant ships were generally less heavily armed than their German counterparts, and Japanese aircraft, while highly maneuverable, were lightly built and vulnerable to the Beaufighter's heavy cannon armament. Australian Beaufighter squadrons operating from bases in New Guinea and later the Philippines wreaked havoc on Japanese coastal shipping. operating in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable: oppressive heat, tropical diseases, primitive airfields. Australian crews flew thousands of sorties, sinking hundreds of Japanese vessels. By war's end, Beaufighter squadrons in the Far East had destroyed an estimated 700 Japanese ships of various sizes, from small coastal vessels to destroyers. But the Beaufighter's service in the Pacific theater also highlighted its limitations. The later Japanese fighters' aircraft like the Ki-84 Frank and the Ki-61 Tony could match or exceed the Beaufighter's speed and vastly outturn it. Several Beaufighters were lost to Japanese fighters, particularly when caught without fighter escort. As a pure fighter, the Beaufighter remained inadequate. But as a strike aircraft attacking ground targets, ships and infrastructure, it was devastatingly effective. The Bristol Beaufighter remained in production until September 1945. Total production reached 5,928 aircraft across multiple variants, produced by Bristol Ferry Aviation and the Australian Department of Aircraft Production. It served with the RAF, Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, South African Air Force, United States Army Air Forces in limited numbers, and post-war with several other nations, including Portugal, Turkey, and Israel. The final operational Beaufighters were retired from RAF service in 1950, replaced by jet aircraft like the de Havilland Vampire and Gloucester Meteor. Australia continued operating them until 1960 in target towing roles. Today, remarkably few Beaufighters survive. Approximately 5 airframes exist in museums, with none currently airworthy. The most complete example is held by the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, London, a Metcalfe X variant, serial number RD253. So how should we assess the Beaufighter? As a heavy-day fighter. Its original intended role, it was bluntly a failure. It lacked the maneuverability for air-to-air combat against single-engine fighters. Its controls were too heavy for dogfighting. Its size made it an easy target. Attempts to use it as a long-range escort fighter proved disappointing. As a night fighter, it was effective, but not exceptional. It did the job adequately during the Blitz and the subsequent night bombing campaigns, but it was superseded by the de Havilland Mosquito, which was faster, more maneuverable, and had better performance at high altitude. But as a maritime strike aircraft and ground attack platform, the Beaufighter was genuinely outstanding. Its combination of heavy armament, reasonable speed, long range, and ruggedness made it ideal for attacking shipping and ground targets. It could absorb battle damage and keep flying. It could carry a diverse weapon load: cannons, machine guns, bombs, rockets, torpedoes. It could operate from rough airfields in remote locations. Between 1941 and 1945, Beaufighters sank an estimated 1,100 Axis vessels of various sizes, more than any other Allied aircraft type. They destroyed countless locomotives, trucks, and infrastructure targets. They provided crucial support during amphibious landings. They flew over 50,000 operational sorties. The aircraft saved bomber crews. In a manner of speaking, yes. By destroying supply ships, Beaufighters helped strangle Axis forces, shortening the war. By attacking enemy positions, they reduced the threat to Allied bombers. By serving as night fighters, they protected British cities, and by extension, the aircraft factories that built bombers. But perhaps the more accurate assessment is this: the Beaufighter succeeded precisely because it failed at its original role. Had it been an effective heavy-day fighter, it might have remained in that role, gradually becoming obsolete as more capable fighters emerged. Instead, by proving inadequate as a fighter, it was freed to evolve into something more useful, a strike aircraft that exploited its genuine strengths rather than fighting against its fundamental limitations. It's a reminder that in warfare, adaptability often matters more than initial design intent. The aircraft that succeed are often not those that best match their original specifications, but those that find the role they're truly suited for. The Beaufighter found its role attacking ships at wave-top height, dodging flak, firing rockets and cannons, and then escaping at low level before enemy fighters could respond. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the subject of propaganda posters. The pilots who flew Beaufighters don't have the fame of Spitfire or Hurricane pilots, but they sank ships, lots of ships. And in a maritime war where supply lines determined survival, that mattered enormously. Leslie Freese's improvised design, cobbled together from existing components in 1938, served on every front of the Second World War, adapted to roles nobody originally envisioned, and proved effective long after many more advanced aircraft had been retired. That's not failure, that's pragmatic success. The Beaufighter was never the aircraft anyone planned for, but it became the aircraft the war required. And sometimes that's exactly what matters.